Hi. Before I begin, I suppose I should say something first. I'm a man, and just like everyone else, I'm not perfect. Far from it. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life so far. I've struggled with a lot of my past negative acts, and continue to do so. That should do it, as far as who I am. Regarding the video, I had to start with the basics first. I had to define certain things first. So the first part may be boring and tedious. I just hope it doesn't bore you all the way to the end. And I hope the text-to-speech program I am using doesn't annoy you too much. Anyway, I would like you to ask yourself a question. What if the universe was really just one big consciousness, and our individual consciousness were inside that big consciousness? And our minds are just an extension of the mind of the universe. Then, it should be possible to just look deep enough inside our own consciousness in order to connect with the big consciousness of the universe. So I looked deep inside my consciousness for answers to my questions of: how did the universe start? How did it get created? Who are we? What is my reason for existing? And what is my purpose? I looked deep in my consciousness, and the message in this video is the response. First, let's start with the answer to the question of who we are. Well, apparently, we are consciousness, fractal, evolution, or confraction. Confraction is a process that reveals that the consciousness is an energy that continues to exist and evolve after our physical bodies have died. It is also the process showing that the consciousness evolution is how the universe expands. It is similar to how life or matter forms through the process of fractals. First, we start with an individual consciousness, or what some refers to as the soul. In this figure, the consciousness is represented as the yin and yang symbol, which is spinning the same way as galaxies, solar systems, stars and planets do. It also represents the duality in nature. After our physical bodies die, our consciousness moves on into the universe. During this time, the consciousness purges itself of the negative energies it has accumulated during its physical existence, or human lifetime. This is also known as purging. The amount of time it spends during this purging process depends on the amount of negative energies it has accumulated. Negative energies are mostly the bad deed or harmful acts committed during a lifetime. Harmful beliefs and emotional injuries are other types of negative energies. While purging, the consciousness attracts other consciousness and connect with each other. The process is similar to magnetism. Those with similar energies, positive or negative, connects. But as a consciousness becomes more positive, then it is able to move on and connect with other more positive consciousness. These consciousness gathering or collectives is similar to what happens with people, where those who are like-minded attract one another. People with negative consciousness, like for example criminals, connect and gather around the same groups. Much like the way bankers, brokers, or politicians gather around the same area in Wall Street and Washington, D.C. So the process of connecting with other consciousness already begins while the consciousness is still inside our physical bodies. And the process of connecting with the positive collective consciousness in the universe is happening while we are still alive. This process is called a consciousness ascension, or simply moving up to a higher level. A consciousness moving onto a more positive group is called an ascension. It is a process of evolving into a higher level of consciousness. With each ascension, the consciousness grows. Throughout the whole process, the individual consciousness grows to at least 3 times the original size it started with. Because the consciousness does not have a shape nor perimeters, the assigning of a size and growth will make more sense later in the process. At these early stages, each group is not completely positive and still contain traces of negative energy. But as the collective consciousness progress, they help each other get rid of the negativity and ascend as a group. Also, at these stages, the collective consciousness share each other's experiences and discover certain abilities. As they move through the process, these abilities become stronger, and more are discovered. Abilities are gained only as the consciousness become more positive. Negative energy suppresses these abilities and prevents them from being accessed. One such ability is access to the library of the universe, though access is limited depending on the level attained by the collective consciousness. It is through the library that other abilities are discovered. The library has different levels that opens the door and unleash an ability. The higher you get, the more powerful the ability. The library is not just a source of knowledge, but it is also a source of great energy. The library is the collection of all that makes up the universe, and therefore infinite. The infinite wisdom of the universe knows the harm a negative consciousness can do if allowed access to the library. So the library is created so that only positive consciousness can have access. And since some positive groups are still purging and contain traces of negativity, then access to the library is limited only to the lower levels. At this point, let me explain a little what is going on inside these groups of collective consciousness. First, the whole idea of a consciousness fractal is that our collective consciousness is inside a bigger consciousness. Then, that bigger consciousness is part of a collective of consciousness that is inside an even bigger consciousness, and so on. So, let's go back to our main group. Now inside this group is a growing single consciousness. It is inside this growing single consciousness that the group can create things. Things such as an island with a tree, or places with houses they can live in, if they like. As they ascend, and their collective consciousness grows, the single consciousness also grows. And they can create more, or bigger stuff, like a planet. But it is only inside this growing single consciousness that they can create things. At this point, the collective groups is not able to create or make changes to the current galaxy or universe they're in. Only the larger consciousness that the collective groups of consciousness are inside of can create and make changes. Again, only at this point in the process. It changes, and I will explain this more later as we move along in the ascension process. Imagine how it feels to be a part of this group of positive consciousness. What would you feel? And what would you do? I would probably feel like a child who just suddenly learned how to fly and discover the wonders of the universe that awaits, and to be able to share it with all the other consciousness. Keep in mind that this process has been going on since the beginning of time and will continue for the rest of eternity. Yet the experience seems to begin as though it is happening only for the first time. It is the infinite genius of the universe at work. The next level in the ascension process is joining the chain of consciousness. After the whole generation of a group of consciousness from different parts of the galaxy have become positive enough, they connect to form a big ball of consciousness. This ball then connects to a chain of consciousness that continues to move to higher levels. As it moves on, the ball is then connected and joined with a higher level of consciousness that have already cycled through the process more than once. In each galaxy, a consciousness cycles 12 times and gets bigger with each cycle. Though the description process is not entirely alike, some would call this cycle reincarnation. Every time a consciousness cycles, it moves closer or inhabits the areas closer to the center of the galaxy. Each cycle moves it closer. So as the chain of consciousness moves closer to the center of the galaxy, it is joined with older consciousness. Within the consciousness ball, the older consciousness occupy the inside of the ball, closest to the center. Every time a consciousness cycles, it is reborn into a being or civilization that resides in an area closer to the center of the galaxy. I'll explain how the cycle works later on, but first I need to explain the areas that the consciousness and the void residue travels through. Here is a picture of our galaxy. It has 2 major arms and 2 other minor arms. The bright parts of the arms are where concentrations of consciousness reside. The dark parts are where the void residue are, or travels through. The void residue is the waste product of the void energy. The void residue is somewhat like antimatter, but invisible like consciousness itself. After it is processed, the void residue is used as energy to grow the galaxy and its consciousness. On this picture, notice the location of the Sun and the planet Earth. It is located on the edge of where the void residue flows. The void and its waste product will be explained more later. Here is another depiction of the galaxy showing the different cycle areas. Every time a consciousness collective moves into an area, it is joined by the older consciousness in that area, and it grows bigger. And the knowledge of the older consciousness is also shared within the collective. So the consciousness is constantly learning about the universe, creating things, and experiencing the memories of other consciousness. For the consciousness, the passage of time changes, and with every area it moves into, time gets slower and slower. The consciousness is moving faster through time, and is able to do more things and be at more places at the same time. So to quickly summarize, when our bodies die, our consciousness continues to exist, and moves on into the universe. As our consciousness moves on, it connects with other consciousness whose bodies have also died. This collective of consciousness moves towards the center of the galaxy, and grows as it continues to connect with other older consciousness whose bodies have also died. That's pretty much the gist of it. Now we get to the part of the galaxy that's inhabited by the consciousness that's made of pure energy, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th cycle consciousness, the last 4 rings of the center of the galaxy. But before that, let me briefly mention the types of beings and civilizations that inhabits the different cycle areas. In my illustration, I used circles to separate the cycle areas just to make it easier, but the boundaries are actually more warped, like this. We'll stick with the circles. Here, I numbered the areas inhabited by the different cycle intelligent beings and their civilizations. Of course, the closer to the center, the more enlightened and civilized. Some of these civilizations are over 1 billion years ahead of us, and those closer to the center are billions of years ahead of them. Regarding their physical descriptions, there's so many that every type of species you can think of exist. Here is a grouping of the types of intelligent beings by cycles. 1 to 4 cycle consciousness are physical types of beings, which means they have physical bodies such as ours. We humans are 2nd cycle consciousness. 5 to 12 cycle consciousness are non-physical types of beings where cycles 5 to 7 are single elemental types, such as those found in the periodic table. 8th cycle consciousness, unlike the 7th, are not just single elements, but all the elements combined. These types of beings can combine all the elements and transform into anything living or non-living. 9 to 12 cycle consciousness are pure energy. Note that every time a consciousness cycles into a being, it loses its memory, but it has the ability to remember its previous cycle. The more evolved or enlightened a being is, the more it is able to remember, especially when it is able to connect with its equal or higher consciousness in the universe. Now back to the final 4 rings of the center of the galaxy. These areas are inhabited by beings made of pure energy or light. These beings are described as made of love and light. The love part is the consciousness and the light part is energy. The final 4 rings, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th, are actually just one ring, but the consciousness cycles back into this ring 4 times. The first time the consciousness cycles into the ninth ring, it starts out as a small ball of energy, and it grows. These energy beings are actually just consciousness and energy, and they don't die. They perform their purpose, and then later move on as a consciousness, with all the other consciousness passing through the cycles. Moving on with the cycles are necessary because of four main reasons. The first is because cycling is how galaxies exist and grow. Second is that it is how energy from the universe flows into galaxies, much like the way the heart pumps blood into the body. Third is that cycling is part of how a consciousness grows and creates new galaxies. The fourth is that cycling is how all the consciousness connects with all the other consciousness, including the very first consciousness, which is God. I'm going to change pictures to show the flow of consciousness and the void residue into the inner circles of the galaxy. In creating a galaxy, the consciousness is a necessary part of the power source. The consciousness is the thinking part of this power. The void residue is the other part of the energy structure, the destructive part, but can be combined with consciousness to create usable energy. You can see in every galaxy the spiral that the consciousness and the void creates, like water spiraling down into a drain. The material parts, like the planets, spread outwards, but the consciousness and the void residue spirals in. The void residue enters into the ninth circle and is taken and processed into a usable energy, or safe energy, by the ninth cycle beings. This will be explained a bit more later in the second part of this video. The safe energy is then absorbed into the inner circles of the galaxy and distributed throughout the galaxy by the ninth cycle beings. A special kind of energy is also created to be used inside the very center of the galaxy as part of the final cycle process. The ninth cycle beings not only process and distribute energy, but they also transform energy into the different elements, or the building blocks of matter in the universe. The 10th cycle beings are the ones who fixes the galaxy and create new planetary systems. They work with the 8 cycles to do this. The 8th cycle beings can be any or all elements and are able to transform themselves into anything. They can do this with the help of the 10th cycle beings. These are the levels in which the occupying consciousness is allowed by the bigger consciousness of the galaxy to create and or fix the galaxy. These higher beings can do anything except change the destructive nature of the void, nor create new consciousness like ours. Say if the planet Earth was completely destroyed, these higher beings can come in and restore it to mint condition. They can turn any dead planet into a living planet. Again, they cannot create new consciousness like the ones we have, only the cycling process can do that. But these higher beings can add consciousness to planets, which are used to give consciousness to the living things inside that planet. These consciousness comes from the collective consciousness that's set aside or reserved to be used for the galaxy. These type of consciousness are different from the ones we have, in a way that they don't cycle or grow the way ours do. They only cycle within the planet they are assigned to. Now back to the inner circles and onto the 11th cycles. The 11th cycle consciousness are the ones that run the galaxy. These beings are the ones that make sure everything in the galaxy is running perfectly. Then we get to the 12th cycle consciousness. These are the ones that prepare and take the collective consciousness into the heart of the galaxy, or the jump. Before we get to the jump, let me just explain that the cycles of the final 4 consciousness happen very quickly. It happens so quickly that it seems that these beings of energy never even left the final circles when they do the cycles. This is how the collective consciousness communicate with the consciousness of the galaxy and the universe. It's like a continuous pulse between the inhabitant consciousness inside the galaxy consciousness, and the rest of the universe. Much like the way the brain works when signals are sent through its neurons to communicate with the body. Back to the jump, The 12th cycle consciousness are the ones that receives and handles the special type of void residue energy created by the 9th cycles to be used for the jump. Let's call these energy the jump energy. These jump energies are positioned at the opposite end, or one side of the hole opening at the center of the galaxy. Here's an illustration. The jump is when the collective consciousness falls into or jumps into a hole at the center of the galaxy. At the same time, the void energy falls in at the opposite entrance of the hole. It's much like playing a game of shooting a ball into a hoop. This process was actually depicted by the Mayans in a ball game, which teams competed to pass a rubber ball through a stone ring or hoop as a representation of the struggle in the universe between light and dark. In this case, the light is represented by the consciousness, and the dark is represented by the void energy. But the mind game seemed to have turned into a deadly ritual, most likely due to the negative influence of the void residue. This is how it works. The 9th cycles passes the jump energy, which is a more concentrated form of the void residue, to a 12th cycle being positioned at the bottom of the galaxy. Prepared especially for this task, the 12th cycle being catches or taps the jump energy into the hole at the center of the galaxy. At the very moment the jump energy enters the hole, a collective consciousness led by another 12 cycle consciousness enters the other end of the hole at the center of the galaxy, making a jump, so to speak. Now something occurs at the center. When the jump happens, the jump energy turns into a more concentrated version of the void energy and starts to chase the collective consciousness that entered on the other side, and the collective consciousness in turn chases the void energy. Sort of like playing a game of tag, but this one goes round and round, creating a spinning motion or yin and yang. This will be explained more later in this video. This game of tag happens so fast that the effect is like a flash of light or an explosion that quickly dissipates. This is what it would look like if we were able to see. After the 12th cycle consciousness catches and taps the jump energy into the hole, it positions itself next in line and connects with a collective consciousness that's also waiting in line, then together makes the jump. The jump happens continuously like the flow of water in a river. There's a continuous flow of consciousness falling into the center of the galaxy, being met by a continuous flow of void energy falling in at the other end. This creates a continuous spinning, pumping energy and consciousness into the galaxy and the universe. With every jump, this is what happens in the galaxy. The flash, or what could be described as an explosion, sends out debris from the void energy back into the edges of the galaxy, where eventually it finds its way and flows back into the center of the galaxy. The same thing happens with the consciousness, except the consciousness have predetermined areas that they cycle into after the jump. The jump also creates new consciousness and new void residue, well new to the galaxy, coming from the larger galaxy that created this current one. These new consciousness starts out as first cycles. The infusion of new consciousness and void residue is what expands the galaxy. It's much like blowing air into a balloon. Consciousness that were trapped in the void residue are also released through the jump. This will be explained more later. The jump is also the way that a galaxy, or the universe, is able to branch out and expand by creating new galaxies. The branching out looks much like the way a tree branches out, like in this depiction. When the jump occurs, the 12th cycle consciousness continues on and travels into one of the branches of energy created by the current galaxy and settles on a limb to start a new galaxy, much like the way a tree creates leaves or fruits. This is how fractal evolution works. Of course, in reality, this tree would have trillions and trillions of galaxies growing in it. Okay, now I'm going to talk a bit about what happens to the collective consciousness after the jump. At the center of the galaxy, the sense of time is different from ours, especially for a pure consciousness. They're able to move so fast that compared to us moving so slow that it's as if we are frozen in our tracks. The molecules that hold matter together in our material world would just hang there and make everything look transparent and very pliable to the higher cycle consciousness. But the point is that our view of the world as second cycle beings is based on the material world that we've experienced, and it's a lot different from the world being experienced by pure consciousness. So it's difficult to exactly have things in the consciousness world explained to us in a material way, based on what we've experienced. The only way is to use examples that occur in the material world to describe what is going on in the pure consciousness world. It is because of this that attempts by human scientists to describe what is going on in the universe and how it all started using mathematics and other methods will always fall short in explaining what is going on. Anyway, let's move on. The collective consciousness gets very large by the time it gets to the jump. Through its journey to this point, it has amassed billions of consciousness, depending on the size of a galaxy at a certain point in time. It's difficult to assign a particular number as to how many consciousness there are in a jump, because the number grows with every jump, and the hole at the center, along with the galaxy itself, also grows with every jump. But as mentioned earlier, a part of the collective consciousness, the 12th cycles, moves on to create its own galaxy, and the 11 other consciousness groups recycles back into the galaxy. Keep in mind that by the time the consciousness reaches the 12th cycle, it has gotten very big. Again, it's difficult to put a size to a consciousness because it doesn't have a shape nor perimeters, and difficult to describe exactly in a material way we can understand. Let's use the Fibonacci series to show how material things grow. Showing on the screen is the Fibonacci series up to 12. Notice that starting from 1, the series has grown to 144 by the time it reached 12. So think of a pure consciousness that does not have boundaries and multiply that by 144. And that's just 1/12th cycle consciousness. Let's say that by jump time, within that generation of 12 cycles, there's a couple of billion consciousness. Now multiply that couple of billions by 144 to get an idea of how big that is. Can you imagine the size of that? That's just the 12 cycles, and doesn't include the 11 other consciousness cycles in one jump. And there's a jump every fraction of a second. There's a reason why they get so big. It's because part of the size is used to create a new galaxy, and to populate it, and other galaxies with first cycle consciousness. And while the new galaxy is still growing, part of the consciousness, the main one belonging to the new galaxy itself, is the one making sure everything is running perfectly, and provide higher consciousness groups to guide the new consciousness through the cycles. There's a lot more to this that can fill volumes of books, but that's for another time. I just also want to mention that part of any slight changes, new features, or old ones, within this new galaxy, was already created and designed during the cycle time by the collective consciousness before the jump. But let's get back to the main point I'm saying about this part of the process, which is to explain the reason for the consciousness growth and how that adds to the growth of the galaxy and the universe. So back to the Fibonacci series to show which parts of the consciousness is used for galaxy growth and which parts used to cycle back. There's a little bit more math on this part, so those who does not care too much for math can just ignore this part. You will not get confused as we move on later. Earlier, I mentioned that the consciousness grows to at least 3 times its size during every cycle. Let me use this illustration as visual for the consciousness cycle. This consciousness going around represents one cycle. So on the series, it, or let's say they, because it's a collective, starts with 1. Then they grow 3 times to become 3 in the first cycle. Then they recycle for the second time, but get smaller, back to the size of 1. Meaning that the generation of first cycle consciousness loses 2/3 of its size and/or its numbers. This illustration is not just for the size of one consciousness, but also for the whole group that's recycling. So during the first cycle, losing 2/3 usually means the 2 out of 3 consciousness did not make it during the cycle. First cycles are smaller in size and numerous, but also very vulnerable, and most will likely not survive the first journey. Much like the baby turtles that just hatched and runs for the safety of the sea in order to survive. The first cycles are very vulnerable to the negative effects of the void residue. I will only mention a little bit about the void and its residue for now, but it will be explained more later on. The void residue in its raw form is basically the waste product, or the dead parts, of the void energy. The void is the opposite of the consciousness. Much like darkness is to light, or death is to life, or bad is to good. So the void is basically the bad part, and now imagine the kind of waste product, or residue, it creates. But the void residue is eventually processed by the 9th cycle consciousness into safe energy, but in its raw form, it has a very negative impact on the lower cycle or younger consciousness. It's like having babies play in the sewer or toxic area and then dies from infection or chemical poisoning. The void residue has the same negative effect on the lower cycle consciousness. When I say the first cycle loses 2 out of 3, I don't mean that these consciousness dies, because the consciousness doesn't die, but rather they get swallowed up by the void residue. These swallowed up consciousness does not get to complete the 12 cycles, but instead must flow with the void residue until they are freed up through the jump. Then they cycle back into the galaxy, but this time a 2nd cycle consciousness. Flowing with the void residue takes the same amount of time as it does to complete 12 cycles. Again, this will be explained more later. Back to the Fibonacci series. So the first cycles lose 2 out of 3. Now we go to the 2nd cycle consciousness. That's where we humans are at. Remember, I pointed out earlier the location of Earth in the galaxy, along the edges of the void residue flow. Because of this, we humans are very vulnerable to the negative effects of the void residue. The 2nd cycles start at 1, then grows to 3 at the end of the cycle, then recycles back to 2, meaning that they only lose 1/3 of their size, or 1 out of 3 of their numbers, this time around. But this doesn't mean that all the 33% of the consciousness that didn't make the trip were swallowed up by the void residue. Some were maybe just waist deep, and it just took some time to get itself loose from the residue, and then joined a different generation of consciousness, most likely ones that were trapped, like themselves, to finish the cycle. During the 2nd cycle, it's most likely the size of the consciousness that is lost, and not its numbers. Keep in mind, all the first cycles that were swallowed up by the void residue recycles back to 2nd cycle when they get freed, so there's a lot of 2nd cycle consciousness. And the 2nd cycles that got swallowed up recycles back again to 2nd cycle, but this time to an area farther from the flow of the void residue. The 3rd cycles start at 2 and grow 3 times to 6, then recycles to 3. Meaning it loses 50% or half of its size. By the time a consciousness has cycled 3 times, it starts twice the size of our human consciousness. And that's just when it's a baby and can grow to as big as 6. So 3rd cycles are pretty much an adult by this time and are able to quickly become enlightened and can easily fend off the dark influence of the void residue. And 3rd cycles know how to care for their own as a group. So when it recycles back into the 4th cycle, it has lost size and not numbers. But there's always growth in each cycle. Let me clarify that the loss of size has to do with how much consciousness energy was given or used during the jump process. Because of the vulnerability of the lower consciousness to get swallowed by the void residue, the higher cycle consciousness, in this case, the third cycles, has to compensate by using their size to make up for the difference. It's like a city that draws power from several sources. If one slows down, then it draws more power from the other sources. I can continue on with this, but I think you get the point as far as the growth of the consciousness in each cycle, how that's used, and what prevents them from growing, which is basically the negative influence of the void residue. Also, that the third cycle is when the consciousness becomes an adult. From there on, it's smooth sailing. And when too many of the lower cycles are swallowed by the void residue, it affects the third cycles. So, too many falling to the influence of the void residue can affect the growth of the galaxy and may require a galactic intervention. This will all fit together later on. So I think that should do it for the math part. Before I move on to the next part of the video, entitled, How the Universe Started, the Birth of God, I'll point out one more thing. It's about how the galaxy works and expands through the jump cycles. It works the same way as it does inside your mind or inside your consciousness. Like the inner circles in the galaxy, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th circles, there's also inner circles and cycle jumps inside your consciousness. It's how the stream of thoughts and memories are created by your mind. There's a spinning also occurring inside your mind, expanding your consciousness. It's all about taking control of the inner circles and the balancing of the energies that flows in. Any parts of this video that needs clarification should be clarified in the next part of this message. I'll leave you with that for now.